Welcome everyone to our webinar. Thank you for the thumbs up, Liama. Thank you. Welcome everyone to the Black Girls Rising webinar. I'm Kagisha Shugambana, and today I'm co-hosting with Olwam Fumanisa. Today, we will be exploring the importance of climate finance on climate change and how both of those things can inspire action for a healthier planet. First of all, what is climate finance? Climate finance is money that is used to fight climate change. It can support projects that reduce emissions and help communities adapt. But the big question is always, who gets the money and how is it used?
Climate change is a huge environmental issue that is not only affecting the earth, but is also affecting us, the people, animals, and plants. To fight climate change, we need tools and resources, and climate finance is there to help.
Today, we'll be hearing from our guests who will share how climate finance can help us fight and take action against climate change to create a much better world for us.
Before we begin, we all know that each and every house has rules. So here are our house rules. First of all, this session is being recorded. Please use the chat to share reflections or ask questions. Please keep yourself muted unless speaking during Q&A. Now, getting into today's business, we are honored to welcome our guest, Courtney Morgan, who works with the African Climate Reality Project. She is a climate justice activist and a feminist. Morgan understands the link between climate justice and social justice, and she is determined to build movements and campaigns at the local level that help build resilience to climate change, alleviate poverty, and reduce inequality. She has done work on the Climate Justice Charter for South Africa and activism for the South African Food Sovereignty Campaign. She holds a BA in Geography and International Relations, a BSc in Geography, and a MA in Geography from Wits University. Courtney, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. Hi, everybody.
Hi. Thanks for joining us.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks for that wonderful introduction. Can we get started? Cool. There aren't many people in the room, so if I feel like people can put on their cameras, say hi, just so we feel like, a bit more connected. I'm gonna start by sharing my screen and hopefully it works this time. Cool. So you guys are seeing my presentation? Yes, and you don't see anything else, just the presentation, right? Cool beans. Cool. So as I was introduced, my name is Courtney Morgan and I'm the senior campaigner at the African Climate Reality Project. But I also represent the Fair Finance Coalition of Southern Africa, and we're a coalition of organizations who work on climate finance, transparency, accountability. And I want to start this conversation by saying, as you heard from my bio, I am not a climate finance expert. I'm not an economist. I am literally just a climate justice activist who saw the need to work on finance, and we can explore why that need came about, right? As you heard, I'm actually a geographer and I'm really not good with numbers. So hopefully this presentation is going to help you understand finance, but from the perspective of somebody who is not an economist. I'm not sure if we have any economists in the room. But yeah, so I just hope that in the session, I'm going to talk about my experiences and the work that I do. But I hope that I can also learn from all of you in the room and we can kind of understand things together as well. And what we like to say at the coalition is basically that finance is too important to be left up to economists, and we'll unpack why. So having said that, let's talk about the basics. So as the introduction did say, quite simply, climate finance is defined as any financing or money that is mobilized for climate action through any means at any level. So it can be local, national, transnational, which means between countries. It can be private or public money, right? And you might ask, what do you mean by climate action? And climate action generally falls into these three categories. So the first one is mitigation, which I'm sure many of you know is the effort to reduce the cause of climate change. And then you've got adaptation, which is any effort to change behavior or infrastructure to deal with the impacts of climate change. Or now, as we're seeing, loss and damage financing is also becoming quite important, which is financing needed for when you have loss of life or damage to infrastructure, when mitigation or adaptation did not limit harm. So to recap, you've got mitigation, which is addressing the cause of climate change, adaptation, which is addressing impacts that are already happening, and then loss and damage is when those two things have not worked and you still have an emergency. That's loss and damage financing, and often that money is needed in a shorter amount of time. So think KZN floods, that kind of thing. Those are what we call loss and damage events. And while, that kind of does seem restrictive in terms of the definition of climate action, a lot of things can actually fall into these categories. So, and we can kind of explore, what counts as climate finance. But for example, installing solar panels can be done using climate finance. But also things like skills building, research on climate action, all of those things also count as climate action and can be used and can be done through climate finance. And I will say this is kind of part of one of the issues that we have around climate finance is that not everyone agrees on what is and what is not climate finance. And you can imagine, like with corruption and that kind of thing, a lot of people will try to fit climate finance into certain things that maybe don't count. But having said that, now that we kind of have an idea of the basic definition, so if anyone ever asks you what climate finance is, you have a sentence, right? But I'm sure you're kind of thinking about what does it actually look like. So firstly, these are the types of climate finance you get. It's not all of them. Climate finance is also an emerging thing. So there's a lot of creative ways that climate finance is now being given to countries or to organizations. But what you will normally hear about in the space are these four. But there's also other things like export credits or co-financing of projects or other types of financing, right? But firstly, we have budget allocations. And this is, for example, the money put aside in South Africa's budget for climate finance, which would be usually your public funds. And this is part of like your national budget. So for example, when the finance minister does his budget speech in February, right, he'll say 100 million rand is going towards solar installations at schools, for example. That's a budget item at a national level. That's an example of a type of climate finance or a form that it comes in, right? Then you have grants or grant-based funding. And grants are actually few and far between. We don't see a lot of it. But this is money that you don't have to pay back. And as climate finance activists, this is actually what we call for. We call for grant-based financing, especially in Africa and for the global south, because we actually believe that we know that Africa contributed the least to the crisis, yet we are bearing the brunt of it. And so we deserve what we are calling climate reparations or climate debt from the North in the form of grant-based funding. And at the moment, it makes up a really, really small percentage of money that we do receive. So for example, in the JETP, the Just Energy Transition Partnership that we signed in 2022, only 4% of that money was grants, which is quite unfortunate because most of the financing we receive in Africa is the third type that I have on that slide, which is loan-based financing. And we see this as unjust because it has to be paid back. Loans have to be paid back. And it really creates an unequal cycle when Africa is trying to survive a climate crisis. We're not trying to get ourselves into a debt crisis by surviving the climate crisis, right? So loans are inherently, wherever they are, whether it's climate finance or just like your individual financing, loans are inherently debt producing. So think about your own life. If you have to take a loan from a bank to pay for studies, for example, it becomes your debt to pay back. And what makes it worse and even more unjust is that African countries are essentially accused of having unstable economies. and are seen as what the global financial architecture calls risky investments. So our loan repayment rates are often higher than other countries. So if, for example, if South Africa had to get, or Cameroon or Zambia had to get a loan from the World Bank, the rate at which they are paying back is a higher percentage than a country in the global north, for example, because we are seen as risky. So if you take this all at like a very local and individual level, for example, you have like a gogo who has been running a vegetable stand for 40 years, but she only uses cash and she doesn't have a banking account or bank statements or anything like that. If she had to go to a bank and ask for a loan, she would get a higher rate because she would be seen as a risky investment by the bank. That's just how finances work, right? And she would get a higher rate than, for example, a young, rich white man, right? He would get a better rate on a loan of the same amount from the same bank. This is just how unjust the financial system is, right? And this is why, as climate justice activists, we call for grant-based financing. But it's also why this climate finance issue is a feminist issue, because we know that there are certain demographics and there are certain experiences that are seen as risky. And often at the individual and the local level, it's often women who are running businesses or starting movements or running organizations who are unable to get financing for that because they're seen as risky. And so that's why we say grants are so important, because loans can be so unjust. And then finally, the final form that we're going to talk about is equity. And this is essentially like an entity will invest money in exchange for a portion of ownership. So for example, you have Toyota investing 20 million in an African electrical vehicle startup so that they can own 15% of that company, right? It's not actually happening. It's just an example, right? So those are the kinds of forms. So budget allocations, grants, loans, equity. The last three are external, coming into the country, right? And then you may want to know now, how does that money flow? Like you're saying money comes into the country, you say we can allocate money. How does it all work? And the answer is it's not a straightforward answer. It's more that if you look at these two columns, it's kind of like any of those combinations can happen. But generally, who is giving finance, who is giving climate finance, is usually a multilateral development bank or an MDB, if you ever hear acronyms as well. An MDB is a multilateral development bank, and these are banks that are essentially owned by multiple countries or are invested by multiple countries. So, for example, if you've heard of the African Development Bank, that is a multilateral development bank because you have investors and then you have African countries who essentially own the bank. And then you've got international financial institutions who can also provide finance. And those are, for example, the World Bank. That's an international financial institution, but there are also others. And then you have governments who can provide climate finance, and that's usually countries in the global north. So the US, your European countries, some Asian countries as well. Japan is a big donor of climate finance. And they can also provide climate finance to any of the things in the second column. But you can also get climate finance from the private sector. So private banks, your standard banks, your net banks, but also any private financial institution can provide climate finance. But then also like philanthropy. So you might have a family who's very, very rich and they have a trust or a fund. They can put that money towards climate action. But then you also have global climate funds that some of them are housed under the World Bank, some are not. So for example, you have GCF, which is the Green Climate Fund, or you have the Adaptation Fund, you now have the Loss and Damage Fund. And these are all places where technically you should be able to access climate finance. And then who receives the financing? You have regional banks. So often a smaller bank will be like a disbursement partner. So the Development Bank of Southern Africa, the DBSA, can also give financing, but often they will receive financing from a bigger bank to implement various climate action projects. You then have intermediary organizations, and what an intermediary organization is essentially just like an organization that stands in the middle. So they receive the funds and they disperse it. This is now outside of the government, right? These are usually organizations that are linked to the government but are not like housed under the government. So SANB actually, they actually act. They act as intermediaries quite often in this country for climate finance. And then obviously your national government, so the money can go straight to national treasury. Municipalities, there are certain deals that happen at the local government level. So like the city of Cape Town or the city of Johannesburg may receive climate finance. You can also have private companies receiving climate finance, just depending on what the parameters of applications were. And then you can also obviously receive climate finance as an NGO, as an organization, a community-based organization, that kind of thing. And so any combination of that is the flow of money of climate finance, right? And then the third column is saying who needs the financing, right? We know that communities need financing. We know that solutions to climate change happen at the local level and need to be locally embedded. We also know that local organizations are often helping organize people for climate action, and so they need finance. We know that NGOs need finance. And once again, we know that local governments need finance, because as much as we see national government implementing climate policy, the real change and the real impact that can be long-lasting will happen at the local government level. And so our local municipalities need to be empowered to implement service delivery and that kind of thing, but also take climate action. And the big question is the money getting to who it needs to get to? Okay. Are those who need the money the most actually getting money? And that's the big question. It's the question that we'll continue to discuss. And then in terms of just some of the challenges, because in the climate justice space, we have a lot of challenges that we're constantly trying to solve. And some of the challenges that we experience are, firstly, as we mentioned, finance is not necessarily lining up with historical responsibility and contributions. So as we said, Africa is not getting enough financing. And when we do, it's creating more debt. Then also, because we live in a capitalist world, we are not seeing climate finance being mobilized in the way that we need it. We are seeing finance being mobilized for the sake of profit. And that's why, again, this is a justice issue, is because while you have women, especially in low-income communities, receiving little to no funding for local projects, and communities in Durban still needing to be rehoused after floods, or you have workers in coal industries, all of these people could use more climate finance. That's not where the money is going. Rather, you have finance going to things like electric vehicles or green hydrogen or profit-producing industries, rather than actual justice outcomes and actually surviving the climate crisis. Sorry, and then in this country, we know, and globally at the moment, we have a governance issue. And so governance is a real problem as well. So you've got governments not being able to actually handle climate action, especially in our country where we have so many issues that we're trying to deal with, and service delivery is so poor. Education is struggling. Our hospitals are struggling. Our governments essentially end up outsourcing climate action to the private sector, who, once again, are not going to prioritize people, are not going to prioritize justice, but are going to prioritize profit. And so things like, as I said, research, skills development, social security, all of those things suffer because the climate finance is going to profit-producing companies. yeah, then again, this profit thread is one that's a big challenge for us in climate finance, is because it's also why adaptation receives less financing than mitigation, is because often adaptation is about dealing with impacts and it's dealing with people and society, and it can't produce a profit, whereas mitigation, you have industries, you have the solar, like solar power is an industry that we can invest in and make money off of. But we can't make money off of rehousing people after a flood type thing, right? So we don't, especially in Africa where we are already being affected, the money that we do get is often not for adaptation. And then finally, as we said, the money is not getting to where it needs to be. The money is not getting to local organizations, women and youth-led organizations, all have great ideas on how to solve the climate crisis, but locally led solutions are not being funded. It's often these like big corporate solutions that are being funded and being trusted. And so that's a real challenge for us as climate justice and as climate finance activists. And all this to say is that finance is not neutral, right? As I've explained. Yes, we can talk about finance flows from the World Bank to this organization, to this community, but there's so many nuances that we know that finance is not neutral. And this is actually reflected in a lot of feminist economic justice theory, that market and the economy is not neutral, and that systems themselves, so the economy was built to serve a few. And so challenging that and challenging how the economy works and challenging how finance flows is actually an act of rebellion. And it's really something that as feminists, as activists, this is something that we should be taking up. Just to say, the finance and the economy is not something that happens to you. It's not something that happens to us. We are part of it. If you are paying your taxes or you are an active member of society, you are contributing to our public finance. And so you have a right to actively shape how our economy works and what it prioritizes, right? And especially in the climate justice movement, we see finance as quite a powerful tool to shape the trajectory of our future. And it has the potential to either enable or violate human rights. So finance can either help us fight the climate crisis, or it's going to further entrench us in the climate crisis. And as we do call for a just transition, we have to educate ourselves, our communities and young people, to not only be able to engage in consultations, but actually really provide each other with the language to be able to shape and shift finance to where we need it. And essentially what I mean by this is we need to, the geographers, the teachers, unemployed youth, young people, we need to be able to go into a room where they expect us to know nothing and speak with confidence. We need to be able to go into a room and ask the right questions, because they expect to just say, oh, you know, when they put charts up, it's usually, oh, this is too complicated for you, I'll just go past it quickly. We need to be able to say, no, I understand what that means. Bring it back. Let's look at what the finances are and what you are actually prioritizing. And that's really the work that I do and what I want all of us here to do as well. So now the question is, you have no technical knowledge, you are not an economist, what can you do, right? And my favorite thing to do is simply ask questions. Just ask questions, right? So I am now going to give you a series of questions that you're going to pretend that you are in a room full of lawyers and economists and CEOs, and they are presenting a brand new landmark finance deal to you in your community. They're telling you it's going to create all of these jobs. They're telling you about all of these amazing things. Picture yourself in that room, right? I'm going to give you 4 questions that you can ask that can help you understand, is this deal going to bring human rights, or is it going to further violate human rights in my community? Because unfortunately, we have seen finance deals, even so-called development aid or climate finance even, actually create more harm in communities than help. So these are the questions, but it's also questions for research, right? So if you see that there's a new finance deal that, especially with COP coming up, you see that there's a new financial deal that the government has signed, right? You can do a little bit of research, and these are the questions you should be looking for. So firstly, the first question is who? So imagine you're in this room, all of these people in their fancy suits, and you say, excuse me, Mr. CEO, who is deciding on this deal? Who decides the quantity of financing? Who is deciding, for example, that we need 1.2 billion US dollars instead of 1.3 US dollars? Who is controlling the system that allows for money to flow? Remember, we spoke about how the money flows. Who controls those systems? So who is controlling the DBSA or the private company that's getting the money? Who are the decision makers? Who are the people with power in those spaces that are getting the money and dispersing the money? And then let's say you get the answer to the who. They tell you, no, it's this bank, or it's this fund, or it's this country, whatever. You then ask about that who. So it's still a who question. Why is that country giving us money now? Does it tie into another deal? Is there something else going on at the moment? Do they understand the context of the place they are giving finance to? So is it this random fund in the Netherlands who's giving climate finance to a rural community in the Eastern Cape? And do they understand the context of who they are giving finance to? And do they actually understand what we need in Africa? Or are they just giving financing because it's COP time and they need to put something on their books, right? So the first question is who? The next question is what? Remember, we looked at types. That's the what. What is the makeup of the funding? What kind of financing are we getting? Is it 70% loans? Is it mainly grants? As we said, loans pay back, grants you don't pay back. What is the financing for, right? Sometimes a government will come and be like, oh, we got 200 billion from the US. It doesn't just happen like that. It's very rare that finance deals are given just for general budget support. That does sometimes happen, but rather it might be it's usually for a specific goal. So for example, when we did sign the JP in 2022, that financing the quote was decarbonization of the South African economy. What does that mean? Who gets to decide what that means? And then we can ask, what format is the financing coming in, and what are the conditions or expectations of this money? This is a very, very important part of it, right? Because it's where most African countries get caught out. Because these expectations in finance talk, they are called conditionalities. So loans often come with conditionalities. So for example, you can get a loan for PPE during COVID, right? It's an emergency loan. The World Bank gives South Africa financing for PPE, masks, vaccines during COVID, or to deal with an emergency like a flood, for example. But the conditionality or the expectation is that you have to implement a policy to teach more science in schools, right? Or you have to use a certain percentage of that financing to build schools, right? And it's quite common that you would have some money. So the US gives South Africa this X amount of money, but they say, in order for you to actually get this money, this is our condition. And sometimes the condition can be good. For example, more science in schools, great. More building of schools, great. But the principle of it is that now your sovereignty as a country is tied to money, and it's tied to foreign politics, because in 5 years, when America's next president is perhaps even worse, that conditionality is related to their politics, not our politics. So whether the conditionality is good or not, it's really important that we start advocating for finance that has no conditionalities and that are purely grant-based because of climate reparations, right? And it's really important that we don't let our democracies get tied to foreign politics or conditionalities of loans. So this is all the what. The next question is why. why are donors paying now? So often the person giving the money is the donor, the person getting the money is the beneficiary. So why are donors paying now? Is there a particular political moment that they are trying to take advantage of? Maybe there's an election in your country, maybe there's an election in their country. Is it just before COP? Is it just before World Bank annual meetings? Is there some kind of conference that's happening and that's why they are giving the money now? Another why is it going through a specific channel? So why is it going to the Department of Environment instead of National Treasury, for example? Why is it going to SANBI instead of another organization? Why was this particular private company chosen over another? Are there connections between these people? Why are we not directing money through a public channel instead of private? Like, all of those things have implications. And again, when you're asking these questions, even in your research, you're not implying anything. You're not accusing anyone of anything. You're simply asking a question. And once you have these answers, you'll be able to determine if finance is enabling or violating human rights. And then the last why are certain sectors being prioritized? Why is financing ring-fenced for transportation? Why instead is it not for food sovereignty or food security, right? If your donor country or fund, for example, is known for electric vehicles, and they come and they give you a loan for transportation, to decarbonize transportation, is that because their money is flowing directly back into their countries, or is it actually to support decarbonization in South Africa? It's just why. Why did you choose transportation over food, for example? And then lastly, the last question is how. So now you've done your what, you've done your why, now you're on how, right? Once the money comes, how will this money be dispersed? Now you've signed the agreement, the money is in the account. How is it going to be dispersed? How is it going to be sent out, right? Will there be a bank standing as intermediary, as I explained? Will it go through Treasury? Will it be controlled by the finance minister? Will it be controlled by the Department of Environment or Transportation? How will the finance be accessed? Now, this is very important for us, right? We are NGOs. We are people who need financing. How can it be accessed? So can it be accessed by women and young people, firstly? Are there conditions on who can apply for financing? So, for example, when the money is now being announced that you can apply to use this money, is it usually, do you have to have a certain amount in your bank account before you apply? Do you have to be a large enterprise, or can SMMEs also apply? Or can foreign companies also apply for this financing? It's the how. How will finance be accessed? And then also, how will it be used, right? Will the financing be used to raise other money? So as I explained, often, because we have loans, because we have to pay back loans, African countries will invest in industries that can produce profit so that that profit can be used to pay off the loan. It's literally a debt cycle, right? So you have industries such as education, adaptation, skills development, social security, all of these things suffer because you cannot profit off those things. And so if you don't profit off it, you can't pay back the loan. And then lastly, remember, we're still on how. How is this actually supporting South Africa's just transition? Not the UK's just transition or America's just transition. For example, if we hear that, my favorite thing is electric vehicles, because I find it wild that electrical vehicles are being focused on in a country where most people do not have private cars, right? So for example, if we hear that the money is going to be used for electric vehicles, is that actually going to help a just transition in South Africa, where we know that in South Africa, a lot of people rely on public transport? Or is it really just a profit-making scheme to serve a few elite, right? These are all the how questions. And then lastly, is this what we want? Like, remember, we're trying to determine if this hypothetical financial deal is going to help us or hurt us. So once you have these answers, you can say, do I actually want that? And we need to understand, as civil society, youth groups, as women, as NGOs, small business owners, whatever you are, however you are coming to the space, we actually have a right to say no to financing that is going to increase our debt burden or that doesn't make sense for us. We can say no to these financial deals. We need to discuss how just transition will be funded, right? We know we need a just transition. We know we have all of these solutions, but we have to have a common understanding of how we want it to be funded. Through which institutions? Which are the institutions that we actually trust that can disperse funds well? And are we actually going to use climate finance to recreate inequality? Or are we going to create new systems and new channels for finance that can actually enable sustainable development? You must remember that this capitalist system, the economy, all of these things were not designed for us or by us. And we actually have an opportunity now to create new systems and to think about African definitions of ownership and African definitions of economies, and actually have alternatives to how we disperse and use funds. And so these are some of the things that you can do is ask yourself, do we need this? Is this going to help us? Where's the money going? How is it going to be dispersed? All of those questions that I went through. And those are the main questions. If you are ready to go beyond that, I know that I'm in a webinar with young people. And so the main question is always, what can we do? What must we do? How can we organize? How can we campaign? I'm not going to go into detail about some of the tactics. We can at a later stage if we have the time. But essentially, these are some of the things that we do. Is we do community town halls, so spaces where communities can come together without anyone else, without decision makers, and just saying, what do we think about this? Do we know what this deal is? Like, let's have our common understanding before we go out there and start talking about it. I also believe in education with a purpose. We really believe in not just giving people knowledge, but really giving people skills to go and engage with finance. And then as an organization, we do a lot of humanizing finance, and often through research and writing and storytelling, we try to tell the finance story, but through the lens of justice and lived experience. And you can check out the website for ways that we do that, or you can chat to me after. I'm nearly at the end. And so kind of bringing all of this work together, right, and taking into account all of this work and the experiences we had with communities and labor and youth groups, we actually developed a set of guiding principles for climate finance. And the reason behind this, once again, was we were just a group of climate justice activists who didn't have expertise. We didn't know what we were talking about. And we said, if we know nothing, if we don't know how to read a loan agreement, we don't know anything about finance, what we do know is that we want finance to take a principled approach. And so what are those principles that will guide all of our work and that we can turn into demands when we speak to the media, or where we speak to government, where we speak to decision makers, right? And these are the 8 principles that we came up with at a community town hall about 4 years ago now. The first one is the principle of equity, which is the funding should take into account historic inequalities and ensure redress and equity. Finance is not neutral and can play a role in enabling new forms of support that can advance justice elements. Secondly, the principle of transparency. Public participation in climate finance needs to have free and prior public access to information. That means we need to see the deals way before they are signed. We also believe in the principle of inclusion. So we need diverse stakeholders, especially those directly impacted by any kind of proposed deal. They have to give their free, prior, and informed consent. After consent has been given, stakeholders must then continue to be involved throughout the implementation of the development project or the implementation project. Also, the principle of accountability and governance. So structures, roles, and mechanisms must be clear. Essentially, we need to know who the decision makers are. Can't just be some random person behind a screen. We need to know who they are, and we need to be able to access them and actually engage with them. Then we've got human rights. Finance processes and projects financed must not compromise human rights or environmental and social well-being. We are not putting climate above social well-being, above education, above gender equity. We're not doing that. These things come together. Then you've got gender responsiveness. So finance processes must be aware of and aim to prevent practices that exclude women, particularly in land ownership, economic participation, decision-making, and employment. We know that there are vast areas of this continent that still have really, really exclusive practices. And so climate finance must not further enable those practices that exclude women from making money or for participating in the economy. You then have holistic climate justice as a principle. Climate justice must ensure social protection and justice, such as housing, security, water, food, dignified employment for all. We can do that through climate finance. And then lastly, we really believe in the principle of African-led local solutions. In a post-colonial, extractive, and exploitative global financial system, we have to build and strengthen African-centered solutions, and we have to prioritize that when we talk about climate finance targets. And that's really how we see climate finance being envisioned that can work for justice activists. And as I conclude, I just want to share our principles for feminist organizing. We believe that justice in all its forms, whether climate justice, economic justice, food justice, must have a gendered lens and must be organized in line with feminist organizing processes. And so we also developed the set of principles which guide our work, our events, our interactions. Any kind of workshop that we host are guided by these organizing principles. And so firstly, we believe in the principle of being collective and inclusive. We believe that we have to develop common understandings, co-create spaces and knowledge, and even co-create knowledge. And we must be able to invest in consensus building. Let's all come together and have a safe space to kind of have a diverse discussion, but ultimately come out with one outcome. We also believed in we believe in lived experience, right? We have quite a focus on storytelling in our methodology. We believe that lived experiences of climate finance deals and solutions have to be valued as much as technical knowledge. We also believe that storytelling creates a space for empathy and trust to build. Once we know each other better, we can work together, right? The next principle is that of capacity building. So not just knowledge sharing, but our methodology particularly speaks about political education and taking politics and systems into account. And this is very true in feminist theory as well, where we speak about capacity building as education for liberation, right? And that's truly what we believe in. Once again, transparency and accountability. If this is what we are calling on the banks for, we are also held to that same standard. So as organizers, as campaigners, we must be open and transparent with our constituencies, but we must also be accountable to our constituencies and welcome and encourage feedback. So at the end of this, if you want to tell me that this was way too complicated or I didn't give a good presentation, that's welcome so that I can get better. We also believe in fluidity. So none of the work we do is concrete. So even these principles and the ones I shared before, everything is a living document that we can change with the times, change if it's excluding something. And really every engagement is an opportunity to change and improve our principles and the way that we work. We also believe in being action-oriented. So we always have some kind of campaigning aspect to our work. We believe in reclaiming economics. So as we've been speaking about, challenging the narrative, challenging our power structure. You don't have to be an economist to engage in the economy. And then finally, building trust and solidarity in the movement. So creating understanding between us so that we can advocate for our shared demands that that would benefit all of us and not just a small group. And that's really how we do the work, and how I know that Black Girls Rising also does their work through a feminist lens. And so, yeah, I hope that that was helpful. Just finally, these are some of the resources I can share it in the chat. These are some of the resources that we used, that we've developed. So first of all, we have an activist guide, which most of what I spoke about is in this activist guide. And in the interest of inclusivity, we've actually, we develop the same kind of concepts into various accessible tools. So we also have a video series that will speak to the exact things happening in the activist guide, but now in video form, very accessible. No video is more than 3 minutes, literally an Instagram reel explaining these big concepts. And once again, written for activists, by activists. It's in our language. It's not this high level economics. And you are completely free to use this, to download it, to share it, and to run your own workshops or talks around these things. Yeah, that's pretty much it from me.
Thank you. Thank you
Yeah.
so much. I learned a lot of things that I've never heard of before. And like climate finance, I honestly didn't even know it was a thing, because like I wasn't even sure about like funding. Like I didn't know how funding worked for a lot of communities or a lot of people that actually needed it. So yeah, I really learned a lot, and I'm so glad we got this opportunity to actually have this moment and have this conversation with you. And right now, I'm just going to open the floor to anyone who would like to ask questions. But we do have very little time. So if anyone has a question, please do type it in the chat or raise your hand, and we can unmute, or you can unmute your mic, and then, yeah, we can like go ahead and ask your question so you can get an answer quickly. And yeah.
I see Mhle has put a question.
Okay. Should we read it? Okay. Her question is, how much is or should be allocated to the climate finance? Thank you, Emisha.
That is a massive question, Emihle, and it's actually something that has constantly been discussed at COP meetings, as to how much we need to decarbonize. Progressive civil society at the moment is talking about 1 trillion USD, right? But that is not what's agreed on internationally. So essentially, there was this deal made in 2009, and I'm trying to not take too much time, but essentially in 2009, and the Paris Agreement mandates climate finance, by the way. The Paris Agreement mandates developed countries to give climate finance to developing countries. And in 2009, that was mandated, and the number was set that by 2020, 100 billion USD should be mobilized for the developing world annually. So every year, they should have been giving us 100 billion. They did not meet that ever. We know that, right? And so last year's COP was what we called the finance COP, because we had to then decide on a new number. And according to the Paris Agreement, 100 billion was now the floor, was now the least you could give. And we were trying to come out with, negotiators and governments were trying to find what that number was. Civil society was fighting for 3 trillion. Less progressive said 1.3 trillion, but we didn't get anywhere near that. I could get you the number, but we did not get anywhere near that. And so the number of how much should we be giving is very different in every context, because countries like the US believe that they will bankrupt themselves by trying to get Africa out of a climate crisis. And we say, you guys got us into this crisis, so yes, you should give us money to survive it. Yeah, so that's about the number.
Thank you.
Thank you, Courtney. I did learn a lot, actually. Thank you so much for being here. Speaking about education, I actually have two questions. So the first question is, you talked about education with a purpose. You talked about transparency and inclusion. So my question will be, why is there not so much about climate education? Because I believe if there was education, or if there was much investment on education about climate or advocacy, young people will be more aware and they will take more action, and then leaders will be held accountable. So the second question will be, speaking of leaders and how there's no transparency, meaning there's much exploitation when it comes to funds. Now, how do you hold leaders accountable for misusing the funds for their own gain and not for the people and the environment?
Okay, so the first question on climate education and climate finance education, we actually run a program called the Fair Finance School, with which Emihle is an alumni of, actually. She attended our Fair Finance School, and essentially that is our attempt at increasing climate finance education, right? Because we, as you say, if you don't have the education, you can't advocate, you can't hold anyone accountable. And that's, in all honesty, that's our job. We have to do that because it's an intentional thing. For you to, as a young woman, go into a space and know what a loan conditionality is, they don't want that. Like, they don't want more people to know how the economy works. It's how it was designed. Economists are this elitist group of people intentionally, because we are not supposed to understand it. And so the lack of education around climate finance, around finance in general, is very intentional. And so that's why organizations need to do stuff like this, have a webinar and discuss what climate finance is, right? It's amazing that you guys have done this. And so that's the first question, is that's our job. We need to capacity build, not just education, but capacity building and skills development, because that's what comes with your next question. So if I had sat here and said, this is what climate finance is, this is how it flows, and this is what the challenges are, and end the presentation there, that's education. You guys are learning. But that's not skills development, it's not capacity building. That's why we always talk about the second half of the presentation. The questions you have to ask, the kinds of campaigns that you can run, the ways in which you can engage. The best way that we found in that decision makers actually respond to is research. In all honesty, banks, government, they don't really respond to our, like, the moral side of it, right? Not to say we stop doing that kind of work. Yes, we do need to hold them to a higher moral standard. But when you actually get in the door and you sit across the table from a banker and you're saying, there's people dying in KZN, they don't care. But every second year we do a policy assessment on banks in in the region. And we look and we score them on how well they're doing with policies related to climate change, finance, tax, gender, all of those things. And we take that to them and we say, here's a research paper. Over the last 6 years, we've done 3. Here's how your score has dropped over the last 6 years. Let us explain to you how you can increase your score, because we publicize this. And the best thing is to put them against each other. So we have the African Development Bank and we have the DBSA, for example. And we go into a discussion with the DBSA and we say, do you know that your score is 6, but African Development Bank has 8? Let me tell you how to increase your score in terms of policies. And that's what we do. And we've had really good successes with that. So for me, I think the best way is through the media. Talk about climate finance, talk about your demands, but research is really important.
Thanks for that question, Olam. I didn't think of something like that, and actually, like, makes a lot of sense now that Miss Morgan explains it a lot more. I have a question. I have like for like communities or like a lot of marginalized communities that don't have access to technology or like things like computers or like aren't even taught a lot about sending emails or stuff like that. How do you ask, like, how do they ask for the money or like for the finance that they need? Like maybe their communities have been washed away by floods. How do they ask for that money? How do they get it? Yeah, that's basically my question.
Yeah, it's a really good question. And ideally, you should have a local government who is empowered to do that. So if, for example, in the event of like a flood, for example, victims of a flood should not have to go and ask for money, right? Your government should be doing that. You should have able leaders who know how to use those systems. And so that's the first thing. But the second part of your question is communities who, let's say, want to run their own projects. How do they access funds? It's a big thing that we're doing that we have to work on as well, is because a lot of applications for loans and grants and climate finance is online. And so I know that there's been organizations, especially legal organizations like CER and CALS, who go into communities with laptops and help. So I think it's about community organizing, but it's also strengthening governance, and making sure that our governments are empowered to ask for the money and actually give it to us.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Courtney, and thank you guys for tuning in and for joining us. Please continue to interact on our social media platforms on Facebook and Instagram at Black Girls Rising. Thank you so much, Courtney. And also, I have taken something from you, and it says, start advocating for financing that has no conditionalities. Continue being an activist and continue fighting for what's right. Until next time, stay wiser, stay calm.